Selective blindness. A scholarly re-examination of the slave trade according to the historical record. Before we begin, two things need to be said about this research and why it remains untaught. First, the debt that British taxpayers paid to slave owners until 2015. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. This law abolished slavery throughout most of the British Empire. It freed approximately 800,000 enslaved people in the Caribbean, Africa, and other British colonies. The enslaved received nothing. Their former owners received £20 million in compensation for the loss of their human property. £20 million represented 40% of the British Treasury's annual budget at the time, approximately 5% of British GDP. It was one of the largest government expenditures in British history. The British government did not have £20 million, so it borrowed the money. £15 million came from a loan arranged by banker Nathan Mayer Rothschild and his brother-in-law, Moses Montefiore, documented in Niall Ferguson's History of the Rothschild Banking House. £5 million was paid directly in government stock. To finance this loan, the government issued bonds called gilts. These were financial instruments that paid interest to bondholders until the principal was repaid. Some of these bonds were dated, meaning they matured on a specific date. Others were undated, meaning they paid interest forever until the government chose to redeem them. The slavery compensation bonds were converted over the decades into various consolidated loans. In 1927, they were rolled into a 4% consolidated loan. That loan remained outstanding, paying interest until 2015. In 2015, the British government's Debt Management Office announced the redemption of all remaining undated gilts. As reported by the Financial Times in February 2015, on that date, the last of the bonds financing the slavery compensation were finally paid off. This means that British taxpayers were servicing debt originated from the Slavery Abolition Act from 1833 until 2015. 182 years. Think about what this means. When Her Majesty's Treasury tweeted on February 9, 2018, now deleted but archived, that here's a surprising Friday fact. In 1833, Britain used 40% of its national budget to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The phrasing was technically correct but inverted the moral reality. British taxpayers, including descendants of enslaved people living in Britain, were paying interest on a loan that compensated slave owners, not the enslaved, the owners. The people who profited from human misery received £20 million. The people who suffered received nothing. And British taxpayers funded that compensation for nearly 2 centuries. Who received this money? The records survive. Over 40,000 claims were filed. University College London's Legacies of British Slavery database, a publicly accessible research project, compiled every person who received compensation. The names include some of the most prominent families in British history. John Gladstone, father of Prime Minister William Gladstone, received compensation for thousands of enslaved people on his plantations. Henry Philpotts, the Bishop of Exeter, received over £12,700 for 665 slaves. James Blair, a Member of Parliament, received over £83,530, equivalent to £65 million today, for 1,598 slaves. Henry Lascelles, 2nd Earl of Harewood, received £26,309 for over 2,554 slaves on 6 plantations. Charles McGarrell, ancestor of the Hogg political dynasty, received £129,464, about £101 million in today's terms, for 2,489 slaves. Sir James Duff, an army officer and member of Parliament for Banffshire, was Prime Minister David Cameron's first cousin 6 times removed. He received £4,101, equal to over £3 million today. For 202 slaves he forfeited on the grain sugar estate in Jamaica. The list goes on. Hundreds of British families, many of high social standing, received compensation. Ancestors of former Minister Douglas Hogg, poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and many others appear in the records. Not one penny went to the freed slaves. Zero compensation for centuries of forced labor, brutality, family separation, and dehumanization. The entire sum went to the people who had owned them, and British taxpayers paid for it until 2015. The American slave trade followed the same pattern. The names are known, the records survive. The documentation is extensive in Rhode Island. The DeWolf family of Bristol operated the most documented slave trading enterprise in American history. James DeWolf, who served as both state legislator and United States Senator, commanded the ship Polly on a 1789 voyage, during which he ordered an enslaved woman suffering from smallpox thrown overboard. Though indicted for murder in 1791, he fled to the Caribbean and was eventually found not guilty. The Rhode Island Historical Society holds the DeWolf Papers documenting family vessels including the Nancy, a brig insured in 1804, the Sally, a sloop insured in 1804, the Patty, a schooner insured in 1806, the Swift, a sloop insured in 1810, and the Aurora, a sloop sold in 1794 between 1769 and 1820. The DeWolf family transported over 11,000 enslaved Africans to American markets. Their Mount Hope Insurance Company insured 50 slaving voyages between 1805 and 1807. James DeWolf owned a rum distillery in West Africa, 3 sugar plantations in Cuba, and with his brothers established the Bank of Bristol. The family sent a member to establish a slave auction house in Charleston, South Carolina, where many of their slaving voyages terminated. By the time of his death in 1837, James DeWolf was reported to be the second richest person in the United States. Aaron Lopez of Newport operated on a smaller but well-documented scale. According to Eli Faber's research in Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade, Setting the Record Straight, Lopez and his partner, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, undertook 12 joint ventures to Africa between 1764 and 1774, while Lopez conducted 8 additional solo voyages, for a total of 21 slaving voyages during his lifetime. This occurred during a period when Rhode Island sent 347 total voyages to Africa. Jews owned 10 ships total. The Rhode Island Historical Society holds the Lopez Papers collection MS 541, documenting specific vessels, the industry. A sloop with a 1756 bill of lading, the Hummingbird. A sloop with 1760 accounts, the America. A ship with a 1765 crew list. The Cleopatra, a ship with 1773 accounts, supplies for Africa trip. And cargo booklet, the Kingfisher, a ship with a 1773 agreement, the Active, a schooner with a 1769 disbursement log. Elizabeth Donnan's documents illustrative of the history of the slave trade to America, Volume 3, published by Carnegie Institution of Washington in 1932, confirms additional vessels through primary source documents. Document 165 contains accounts of the Betsy from 1765 to 1766. Document 222 contains the bill of lading of the Cleopatra from 1773. Document 224 contains the bill of lading of the Anne from 1773. The table of contents lists correspondence between Aaron Lopez and Henry Kruger, Jr., dated 1767, as well as documents from the Rivera and Lopez partnership, including letters with Captain William English regarding African voyages from 1772 to 1773. The Lopez Papers at the Rhode Island Historical Society contain a letter dated July 15, 1773, from Captain William English at Anamabu to Lopez and Rivera, quote, "I have enclosed you bill of landing for 30 slaves. I hope you will not take amiss my leaving these 10 slaves behind, as my provisions expense fast, and I am afraid of sickness getting among the slaves I have on board." End quote. James Pope Hennessy, the British historian whose Sins of the Fathers trace the Atlantic slave trade from 1441 to 1807, documented the family networks connecting these operations. Aaron Lopez had a nephew and a son-in-law, Abraham Pereira Mendes, who made trips for the firm to Jamaica and New York in May 1752. The New York Gazette carried an advertisement placed by Mendes offering for sale a parcel of likely young Negro, pimento, coffee, and other goods in 1767 on a mission to Jamaica. Mendes reported back to his father-in-law that a consignment of enslaved people was in such poor order that he could do nothing but sell them off cheaply. His father-in-law Rivera replied that it gave him no small pleasure to learn that Mendes was on the spot to assist in the disposal of his small cargo. Pope Hennessy also documented how the Christian and Jewish trading networks intermarried. Simeon Potter, a ship owner of Bristol, Rhode Island, had a sister named Abigail. Abigail married one of the DeWolf brothers' supercargoes, Mark Antoine DeWolf. A Jew from the French island of Guadeloupe, de Wolfe settled in his wife's hometown of Bristol, and several of their 8 sons entered the slave trade. The most famous of these was the James de Wolfe already discussed. The marriage of a potter's sister to a Jewish supercargo from Guadeloupe produced the most prolific slave trading dynasty in American history. Commerce did not care about denomination. It cared about profit. These are not allegations. These are archived documents, bills of lading, insurance policies, account books, letters discussing cargo. The names of the ships are recorded. The names of the owners are recorded. The numbers of enslaved people are recorded. The dates are recorded. The destinations are recorded. This documentation sits in the Rhode Island Historical Society right now, available to any researcher who requests access. Now consider this in the context of reparations debates. When Caribbean nations, when descendants of enslaved people in America, when activists call for reparations, they are told it is too expensive, it is too complicated, it is ancient history. We cannot afford it, we must move on. Yet the British government borrowed £20 million in 1833, 40% of the annual budget, to compensate slave owners. And British taxpayers serviced that debt for 182 years without complaint. The money existed, the will existed, the mechanism existed. It was done for the owners, not the enslaved. The precedent is clear. Reparations are possible. They were paid. To the wrong people, this matters because it reveals who the system protects. Slave owners received compensation. Enslaved people received nothing. White servants who were worked to death in the same fields, on the same plantations, by the same masters also received nothing. Their descendants received nothing. The only people who were made whole were the people who had profited from human bondage. And when that debt was finally paid off in 2015, the British Treasury tweeted about it as if it were a moral accomplishment. Modern descendants are only now discovering what their ancestors endured and who profited from it. Student journalists at Georgetown University uncovered documents showing that in 1838, Jesuit priests who ran the university sold 272 enslaved people to Louisiana plantations to save Georgetown from bankruptcy. The sale, engineered by university president Thomas F. Mulity, brought in roughly $336,000. About $330 million in today's currency. The enslaved men, women, and children were sold to Jesse Beatty and Henry Johnson and scattered across sugar and cotton plantations in Louisiana parishes, where they labored under conditions that a Georgetown report later called dreadful. Richard Cellini, a Georgetown Law School alumnus, hired genealogists and created the Georgetown Memory Project in 2015. It became one of the largest group genealogy searches in United States history. By 2021, they had identified over 10,000 living descendants of people enslaved by the Jesuits. Elizabeth Thomas, a New Orleans native, discovered through university records that her great-great-grandparents Sam Harris and Betsy Ware Harris were among the infants and children sold. She applied to Georgetown and was admitted under the legacy preference the university established for descendants. Maya Eaglin, a journalist, found a 6-year-old girl named Harriet Eaglin listed in the 1838 manifest. Melisande, a short column, graduated from Georgetown in 2021 as one of the first descendant students admitted. Patricia Bayonne Johnson was the first descendant to discover details about her ancestor and met with university president John D. Gioia in Spokane, Washington in 2016. The university formally apologized in 2017. They renamed buildings after Isaac Hawkins, the first enslaved individual listed in the sale documents, and Anne Marie Becraft, a free woman of color who established a school for black girls in Georgetown. The university established a reconciliation fund of $400,000 annually for community-based projects benefiting descendant communities. 16 descendants have been admitted under special preference. As of 2022, the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation was established with $27 million in funding. Though it explicitly stated it is not pursuing reparations in the sense of individual payments, many descendants want more than symbolic gestures. The Jew 272 Isaac Hawkins Legacy Group, representing about 200 people, calculated what they believe Georgetown owes based on the wealth created by forced labor. They demanded scholarships and cash payments as recompense. As 70-year-old D. Taylor, a direct descendant of Isaac Hawkins, said, "I believe Georgetown has the means to do much more." Their lead counsel, Georgia Gosley, stated, that her clients do not believe Georgetown has fully atoned for the wealth it unjustly accumulated off the back of unpaid slave labor. The Georgetown case is not unique. Yale, Brown, Harvard, Rutgers, Columbia, Virginia, William and Mary, Wake Forest, and many other universities are now examining their historical ties to slavery. What makes Georgetown significant is the scale of the documentation. The Maryland Jesuits were meticulous record keepers. The archives survive. The descendants can be found. The names are known. And the universities that profited from slavery are finally being forced to confront what their establishment was built upon. Second, what this analysis is about, the man who pointed to it, and why neither can be discussed. This audiobook examines what establishment historians actually document about white slavery in colonial America. Not indentured servitude slavery. The sources use that word. Court records and contemporary accounts describe white-bound laborers as slaves. A definition is needed here because critics will claim this conflates indenture with chattel slavery. It does not when this audiobook uses the word slavery. It means a specific set of conditions documented in the legal and archival record. Saleability. The person could be bought and sold as property. Coercion. The person did not consent or was forced. The person was subject to corporal punishment, including torture and death, with minimal legal consequence for the owner. Loss of legal personhood. The person appeared in inventories alongside livestock and furniture. Heritability. Children born to servant mothers inherited their mother's status. The legal distinction between a white servant and an enslaved African was term of bondage, not condition of bondage. During their term, white servants were property. They could be bought, sold, wagered in card games, transferred in wills, bred for profit, and worked to death. The only difference was that if they survived, they might go free, whereas enslaved Africans would not. Many people will have first encountered fragments of this material through a short book by Michael Hoffman II, titled They Were White and They Were Slaves, published in 1993. Hoffman has been described by academic historians as a Holocaust denier and anti-Semitic ideologue. He worked as assistant director of the Institute for Historical Review, an organization focused on Holocaust revisionism. Swedish historian Matthias Gardell stated that anti-Semitism is prominent in his worldview. Critics, including Derek Jensen, have called him overtly racist. These accusations have been used to dismiss everything in his book. His reputation has successfully stigmatized the work to the point where citing it invites immediate accusations of white supremacy, Holocaust denial, and racism. Academic historians will not touch it. Mainstream publishers will not print it. The book remains self-published, available primarily through fringe outlets, untouchable by respectable society. But here's the problem. Hoffman compiled a bibliography of over 160 sources. He cited Abbott Emerson Smith, Edmund Morgan, Peter Wilson Coldham, Don Jordan, Michael Walsh, Sharon Salinger, Richard Morris, and many other mainstream academic historians. These scholars published their work through major university presses. Their research was peer-reviewed. Their findings were documented with thousands of footnotes citing primary sources from colonial archives, court records, shipping manifests, parliamentary papers, and contemporary accounts. These books sit in university libraries right now. They are available, they are real, and they contain far more than Hoffman ever included in his polemical work. The dismissal of Hoffman's book because of his ideology has had the convenient effect of dismissing the evidence he compiled. Discredit the messenger, ignore the message. Any attempt to discuss the documentary record gets tarred with the same brush. You cite Abbott Emerson Smith's 435 pages of archival research, and someone will say, but that is what Michael Hoffman used, and Hoffman is a Holocaust denier. Therefore, you must be a racist. The ad hominem attack on Hoffman has become a shield protecting the Academy from having to address what its own scholars documented. The truth does not care about the ideology of the person pointing to it. If a Holocaust denier says the sky is blue, the sky does not become less blue. If a racist compiles a bibliography of 160 mainstream academic sources documenting white slavery, those sources do not become less real. The evidence was published, peer-reviewed, and ignored because of the reputation of the man who pointed to it. This analysis goes back to those sources. It examines what the scholars actually wrote. It extracts the names, the dates, the ship manifests, the mortality statistics, the court cases, the parliamentary inquiries, the eyewitness testimony. It compiles the evidence that the establishment's own historians documented, then promptly forgot. And it asks a simple question: if the evidence is this extensive, if the documentation is this thorough, if the sources are this credible, why does nobody know about it? The answer is uncomfortable. The historical narrative that America was built by willing immigrants and enslaved Africans is simpler, cleaner, easier to teach. The reality that between half and two-thirds of all white immigrants to colonial America came in bondage complicates that narrative. The reality that approximately 300,000 white people were shipped to America as property, that tens of thousands were kidnapped as children, that mortality rates exceeded 80% in some colonies, that masters who beat servants to death were routinely pardoned, that the system was brutal, industrial, and legal. All of this complicates the story we tell ourselves about American origins. It also complicates the story we tell about race. The comfortable narrative is that racism created slavery. The documentary record shows the opposite. Slavery created racism. Edmund Morgan documented in detail how the Virginia elite deliberately cultivated racism after Bacon's rebellion to separate poor whites from enslaved blacks, to prevent them from uniting against the planter class. Race, as we understand it, was created as a tool of class control. That is in the sources. That is what the scholars found. This matters because the absence of white slavery from the curriculum serves multiple purposes, whether by design or by neglect. It prevents working-class whites from understanding their own history of exploitation. It prevents solidarity between descendants of white servants and descendants of enslaved Africans, both of whom were victims of the same planter elite. It protects the mythology of American exceptionalism by hiding the scale of brutality visited upon European immigrants. And it allows the modern elite to claim that American prosperity was built by free labor and entrepreneurial spirit, when the reality is that it was built on the corpses of hundreds of thousands of people, white and black, who were worked to death in the same fields by the same master. The evidence exists. It was compiled by mainstream historians. It was published by university presses. It won awards, and it has been systematically ignored. Replaced in the curriculum by sanitized textbooks that describe indentured servitude as a voluntary labor contract leading to opportunity. That is a lie. The sources prove it is a lie. The scholars documented the lie. And we teach it anyway. What follows is what those scholars actually wrote: the names, the numbers, the places, the ships, the courts, the laws, the mortality statistics, the eyewitness accounts. All of it drawn from mainstream academic sources published by respectable institutions. None of it requires you to trust Michael Hoffman. None of it requires you to endorse his ideology. It only requires you to read what Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and the University of North Carolina Press actually published. The evidence is there. It always was. Now let us see what the scholars found. Abbott Emerson Smith opened the archive nobody wanted to read. Abbott Emerson Smith's Colonists in Bondage was published in 1947 by the University of North Carolina Press. The book runs to 435 pages of meticulous documentation. Smith spent years in the Public Record Office in London, the colonial archives of Maryland and Virginia, and the records of dozens of county courts on both sides of the Atlantic. His opening line sets the scope. He writes that his book concerns those white people who went to the British colonies and who, because they were unwilling or unable to pay the cost of their own passage, became bondservants for a period of years to some colonial master who paid it for them. The numbers Smith compiled in his statistical appendix are staggering. Approximately 96,600 indentured servants entered the colonies between 1607 and 1699, alongside roughly 33,200 enslaved Africans and 2,300 convicts. That is nearly 100,000 white servants compared to 33,000 black slaves in the 17th century alone. In the 18th century, another 103,600 servants arrived, joined by 278,400 enslaved people and 52,200 convicts. Smith calculated that servants made up approximately 3/4 of all immigrants coming to the colonies south of New York during the 17th century. Across the entire colonial period, between 1/2 and 2/3 of all white immigrants arrived in bondage of one form or another. Think about that for a moment. Between 1/2 and 2/3 of all white people who came to America before the Revolution came as the legal property of someone else, subject to sale, transfer, and corporal punishment with minimal legal consequences for their owner. Servants in name, property in practice, Smith devoted an entire chapter to the kidnapping networks. And it reads like something out of Dickens, except this was real in London. The most active kidnapping gang held daily planning meetings inside St. Paul's Cathedral, the very symbol of English Christianity. Spirits were paid roughly £2 by planters' agents for every athletic-looking young man they delivered aboard a ship. That was decent money for a working man, perhaps equal to 2 months' wages for a laborer. Children and adults were lured or forced onto vessels in the harbor, or carried to the numerous cookshops in the neighborhood of the wharves, where they were kept in close confinement until sold to merchants or masters of ships. The word spirit conveyed a mysterious and terrifying significance across England. Parents lived in fear that their children would be spirited away in Aberdeen, Scotland. During the 1740s, press gangs in the hire of local merchants roamed the streets, seizing by force such boys as seemed proper subjects for the slave trade. Children were driven in flocks through town and confined in barns for shipment. An estimated 600 to 700 children disappeared from Aberdeen's port between 1740 and 1746. These were not runaways volunteering for a fresh start. These were children stolen from their families and sold like cattle. One specific case Smith documented in extraordinary detail involves Peter Williamson, kidnapped from Aberdeen as a child around 1743. Williamson was loaded onto a ship called the Planter alongside 71 other kidnapped Scottish children. The Planter was wrecked at Cape May off the American coast. Williamson was sold for £16 in Philadelphia and served 7 years. His master, Hugh Wilson, was himself a fellow Scot who had been kidnapped years earlier. After gaining his freedom, Williamson later published his autobiography, sued the Aberdeen magistrates and won. The Edinburgh Court of Session found the provost, 4 bailies, and the dean of guild complicit in the kidnapping operation. Named co-conspirators included Walter Cochrane, the town clerk depute Alexander Mitchell of Culpna, and Bailey William Fordyce of Ackworthies. These were not criminals operating in the shadows. These were city officials running a child trafficking operation. Williamson won £100 in damages initially and another £200 in 1768. Smith also documented the full succession of government convict transport contractors. This was not some haphazard deportation. This was an organized business with government contracts, profit margins, and accountants. The contractors were merchants who saw human cargo as a commodity like tobacco or sugar. They calculated mortality rates, shipping costs, and resale values with the cold precision of actuaries. Jonathan Forward, a London tobacco and slave merchant on Fenchurch Street, became the first contractor for transports to the government on August 8, 1718. Forward already ran a profitable Atlantic trade network. Adding convict transport gave him government-guaranteed income, plus the ability to fill return voyages that would otherwise sail empty from America. In his first year, he transported over 400 felons on 4 ships to Virginia and Maryland. The government initially paid him £3 per prisoner, raised to £5 in 1727. Forward held the contract until 1739. He made a fortune. His ships included the Forward Galley, the Eagle, and the Elizabeth. He transported approximately 8,000 convicts during his contract period. Forward was succeeded by Andrew Reed, who secured the position through personal friendship with the Secretary to the Treasury. Under Reed, death rates among convicts on ships reached their worst levels. Ships under his contract saw mortality approaching 30% on some voyages. Reed calculated that even losing a third of the cargo still generated profit, because feeding the dead cost nothing. Next came John Stewart and Duncan Campbell. Campbell was perhaps the most successful of all the contractors. He owned a fleet of ships and operated the convict hulks moored in the Thames where prisoners awaited transport. His ship, the Justitia, served as a floating prison. Campbell averaged £6 profit per convict, representing 70% excess profit per freight space. He transported convicts for decades, becoming wealthy enough to invest in property and ironworks. Campbell's testimony to Parliament was remarkably candid. He stated under oath that rather more than a 7th part of the felons died, many of the Guiol fever, but more of the smallpox. That is a death rate exceeding 14% on each voyage. He had no reason to exaggerate. If anything, he had incentive to minimize the death rate. Yet he admitted to over 14% mortality as routine business practice. Stewart died in February 1772, Campbell then continued alone. But by this point, the trade had become so profitable that other merchants offered to transport convicts for free just to get the return cargo of tobacco. The Treasury refused to renew Campbell's contract, not because the system was inhumane, but because competitors would do it cheaper. Campbell's ship, the Bethia, was later renamed and became famous under another name. That ship, refitted and rechristened, became HMS Bounty. The vessel Captain Bligh would command on his ill-fated breadfruit voyage to Tahiti. The same ship that carried convicts in chains to Virginia later carried Bligh's crew to mutiny in the Pacific. The last convict ship to land in America was the Jenny, arriving on the James River in 1776 just as the Revolution began. Between 1718 and 1775, approximately 50,000 convicts were transported to America. 98% of transported offenders were nonviolent criminals. Predominantly guilty of theft, many crimes were trivial, such as stealing a handkerchief worth less than a shilling. Under the Waltham-Black Act of 1723, over 200 minor offenses became capital crimes. A 14-year-old boy could be hanged for stealing one sheep. William Cobbett documented cases of teenage boys hanged for precisely that offense, with their bodies then fought over by parents wanting to bury their child versus the Royal College of Physicians wanting to dissect the corpse for medical education. The merchants who profited from the Atlantic trade, both in convicts and in enslaved Africans, came from every background. Commerce had no religion if there was profit to be made. Merchants participated in Newport, Rhode Island, which became a major port for both the triangle trade and the spermaceti candle industry. One of the most successful merchants was Aaron Lopez. Lopez was born Duarte Lopez in Lisbon, Portugal in 1731 into a converso family. Portuguese Jews who had converted to Catholicism but continued practicing Judaism in secret. Lopez fled the Portuguese Inquisition and arrived in Newport with his wife Anna and daughter Catherine. He reclaimed his Jewish identity, took the name Aaron, and with help from his half-brother Moses, established himself as a merchant. By 1760, Lopez had become one of Newport's leading traders. He manufactured spermaceti candles, owned a whale oil processing operation, traded in rum, chocolate, textiles, and other commodities. He helped found Touro's Synagogue, the first in the colonies, and was given the honor of laying one of its cornerstones. Lopez financed at least 14 to 21 slave voyages to the West African coast. Historian Eli Faber determined Lopez underwrote 21 slave ships during a period in which Newport sent a total of 347 slave ships to Africa. Records survive for 5 of those voyages, documenting the sale of enslaved Africans in the colonies and deaths of several slaves at sea from disease and fever. Lopez personally owned 5 enslaved people. His father-in-law and business partner, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, owned 12 and used enslaved labor in the difficult work of rendering whalehead matter for candle production. Lopez's slave trading ventures apparently generated little profit and in some cases resulted in losses. His wealth came primarily from his diversified mercantile operations. By the early 1770s, Lopez had become the wealthiest person in Newport. With a tax assessment twice that of any other resident, William Vernon, a Christian merchant, was perhaps the most prolific merchant in the Atlantic slave trade operating from Newport, far exceeding Lopez's involvement. The vast majority of Newport's 347 slave ships to Africa were financed by Christian merchants. Lopez's ships represented approximately 6% of Newport's total slave trading voyages. Yet his involvement was real, documented, and profitable enough to continue for 13 years. The same man who fled religious persecution participated in a trade that deprived others of all freedom. Ezra Stiles, the congregational minister who became president of Yale, described Lopez as a merchant of the first eminence. When Lopez drowned in 1782 after his carriage fell into a pond, Stiles wrote that Newporters mourned him with a demonstration of universal sorrow. The contradiction was not remarked upon. Slave owners marked their human property in various ways. Branding with hot irons was common, as Richard Morris documented across 20,000 court cases. Metal collars were used for runaways or those deemed likely to escape. These collars, forged by blacksmiths, often bore the owner's name, location, and date. Some bore additional markings indicating the owner's affiliations or memberships. Surviving examples include collars engraved with Masonic square and compass symbols alongside the owner's identifying information. One collar reads Hertford and Darley Camp 1748 with the square and compass. Another from Providence, South Dakota, dated 1846 shows Ross and Abel Jaggs, Esquire with Masonic insignia, a Norfolk, Virginia collar from 1823 bears the names Littleton and Perrin with the symbol. These artifacts document what court records and membership rolls also show. Freemasonry in colonial and early America drew members from the merchant and planter classes. Many lodges included slave owners among their membership. George Washington, a Mason, owned over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Benjamin Franklin, Grand Master of Pennsylvania, owned enslaved people for much of his life before becoming an abolitionist in his later years. The overlap between Masonic membership and slave ownership reflected the social composition of the lodges, which drew from the propertied classes who had the wealth and leisure time for fraternal organizations. This does not indict Freemasonry as an institution any more than slave-owning Episcopalians indict the Episcopal Church or slave-owning Baptists indict the Baptist denomination. It demonstrates that slaveholding pervaded every institution in slaveholding regions where slavery was legal and profitable. People with capital participated regardless of their religious affiliations, fraternal memberships. The square and compass on a slave collar is a marker of membership, not of institutional policy. It identifies the owner, nothing more, but it identifies him as a man who professed brotherhood in his lodge while holding other human beings as property. The contradiction existed in the man, not in the symbol. The same selective description applies to how institutions catalog visual evidence from the period. A well-known abolitionist lithograph from 1851, titled Practical Illustration of the Fugitive Slave Law, is held in the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. The print depicts William Lloyd Garrison defending an enslaved woman against a group enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. On the left, the resistance is notably mixed. Garrison, a white abolitionist, holds the woman with one arm and points a pistol with the other. Beside him, a black man also aims a weapon at the enforcers. Behind them, a formerly enslaved man takes a whip to his old master, saying, "It is my turn now, old slave driver," black and white, armed together against the slave catchers in 1851 Boston. That image alone was a statement, riding on the back of Daniel Webster, who crawls on all fours clutching the Constitution, is a heavy-set figure holding a slave collar in one hand and a noose in the other. His speech bubble reads, "Do not back out, Webster. If you do, we are ruined." The word ruined is specifically financial. He is not the reluctant politician or the conflicted clergyman standing behind him. He is the one driving the enforcement and threatening ruin if the money stops, directly behind him. The artist placed the Temple of Liberty flying a banner that reads, "All men are born free and equal." The irony is architectural. The man holding slave shackles stands framed by the promise of universal liberty. On his hat is a six-pointed star. The symbol has two deep and overlapping histories. It is the Seal of Solomon, central to Jewish mystical tradition and Kabbalistic texts going back centuries before any fraternal order adopted it. The Key of Solomon, one of the most important grimoires in the Western occult tradition, is attributed to the Israelite king. Jewish tombstones and synagogue decorations carry the hexagram well before the 17th century. The Prague Jewish community used it on their official banner in the 1400s. Freemasonry absorbs Solomonic symbolism wholesale, with the Temple of Solomon as its central allegory and the pillars Jachin and Boaz, the seal, and the construction narrative all drawn from Jewish esoteric sources. The six-pointed star appears on Masonic tracing boards, aprons, and regalia. It also later became the most common shape for law enforcement badges in the United States, carried by marshals and sheriffs whose institutional origins traced directly to the fugitive slave enforcement apparatus of the 1850s. The Library of Congress catalog describes the figure as a slave catcher who may represent the federal marshals or commissioners authorized by the act. The Library Company of Philadelphia calls him a white man mercenary attired in a top hat with a star on it. The Capitol Visitor Center, which exhibited the print in 2013, says only that it depicts a slave catcher. Every scholarly description stops at the badge of office. Nobody names the symbol. Nobody discusses what a six-pointed star meant in 1851 Boston, where the artist chose it deliberately for an audience that understood Masonic, Solomonic, and commercial symbolism. The same pattern that leaves Masonic square and compass symbols on slave collars, undiscussed in museum displays, operates here. The evidence sits in the national collection. The description walks past it. Slave auctions throughout the colonies were conducted by merchants and auctioneers of various backgrounds. In Charleston, South Carolina, Abraham Solomons operated as a slave auctioneer, advertising sales in 1852 that included men, women, boys, and girls. Isaac da Costa of Charleston, David Franks of Philadelphia, and Aaron Lopez of Newport were among colonial merchants involved in the importation and sale of enslaved Africans. The Seixas family illustrates how deeply the trade could penetrate a single family, and the surviving newspaper advertisements document it in their own words. Abraham Mendes Seixas operated as a slave broker in Charleston from his offices at number 35 King Street. He was a city official and a high official of Synagogue Beth Elohim. One advertisement placed by a Seixas broker reads, "Wanted to purchase 40 or 50 field Negroes, the greatest proportion working hands, for which the cash will be paid immediately." Another reads, "Wanted on hire for 12 months certain, 150 young, healthy, able-bodied working Negroes. 2/3 men, the rest women." These are not small transactions. He was buying and hiring at plantation scale. A third advertisement under the heading "For private sale lists houses and lands in the city of Charleston and its environs. Negroes for the house, field, bonds, notes, canal scripts, a few hundred barrels of rice, elegant gilt-framed mirrors, and the shop of a doctor of physic who is retiring from business." Enslaved people listed between property and rice sold alongside mirrors and medical practices. The same notice ends with "Wanted to purchase, a Negro fellow, capable of working at the blacksmith's trade." Human beings itemized as a line of stock. His relative Isaac M. Seixas held the position of master of the workhouse in Charleston, the facility where runaway enslaved people were confined. A notice in the Charleston City Gazette and Daily Advertiser dated July 12, 1799, lists 4 runaways in his custody: Dick, who says he belongs to Mr. Richard Dennis, living at Savannah Bessem, about 15 years of age; Hester, about 25, and Kate, who says she belongs to Mr. John Goldwire, residing in Savannah. The first joint of the thumb of her right hand off, her right ankle very much scarred, and her left one much bruised, walks knock-kneed, about 30 years of age. The injuries on Kate's body tell their own story. Isaac Seixas signed the notice as master. Their brother Gershom Mendes Seixas was the first native-born Jewish religious leader in America, a patriot who fled New York during the British occupation and later served as a trustee of Columbia University. A watercolor portrait of him painted around 1790 survives in the Museum of the City of New York, showing a composed man in clerical dress. One brother bought and sold human beings by the dozen from King Street. Another confined runaways in a workhouse and cataloged their injuries. The third led prayers and helped govern an Ivy League institution. Nobody at the time seems to have found any of this contradictory. The Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, published by the Goldring-Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life, documents the broader picture in Charleston. According to one study cited in the entry, 83% of Jewish households in Charleston owned at least one slave, a figure slightly lower than the 87% of all white households in the city that owned slaves. Most of the slaves owned by Jews in Charleston were house servants. Mordecai Cohen owned 27 enslaved people who worked his rice plantation. Jacob Nunez Cardozo was a local newspaper editor who was a staunch supporter of the Southern cause and slavery. Charleston Jews, the encyclopedia states, thoroughly accepted the South's defense of slavery. This was not peripheral involvement. This was full integration into the slave economy at every level, from the auction house to the workhouse to the newspaper editorial page. None of this is unique to Jewish Charlestonians. George Washington attended church on Sunday and returned to a plantation staffed by over 300 enslaved people on Monday. The capacity to compartmentalize was not limited to any single group. It was the operating condition of the entire slave-holding world. What makes the Seixas family significant is the completeness of the documentation. The advertisements survive, the workhouse records survive, the portrait survives. The encyclopedia entry was written by the community itself. The evidence is all there. In the family's own words, in their own newspapers, in their own institutions. The Strauss family built a commercial empire that became Macy's department store, Lazarus Strauss emigrated from Bavaria to Georgia in 1852 and settled in Taubaten. Despite reportedly opposing slavery, he owned enslaved people himself. The family conducted business with other enslavers. After the Confederacy's defeat, they took several formerly enslaved people north with them during the Civil War. His son Isidore worked as an aide to a London-based Confederate agent, selling Confederate bonds in London and Amsterdam to finance the rebellion. Isidore returned $12,000 in gold from his bond trading after the war. Lazarus convinced Roland Hussey Macy to allow their family business to open a crockery department in the basement of his store. Isidore and his brother Nathan became Macy's partners in 1888. They acquired full ownership in 1895 and 1896. Isidore later served in Congress and died aboard the Titanic in 1912. Refusing to enter a lifeboat while women and children remained, the Lehman family followed a similar trajectory from slave economy to Wall Street institution. Henry, Emmanuel, and Mayer Lehman emigrated from Bavaria to Montgomery, Alabama, where they established a cotton brokerage in 1850. Cotton and enslaved workers treated as property were among the first commodities on the stock market. The Lehmans were slave owners, deeply invested in cotton. And when Southern states seceded in the winter of 1860 to 1861, Montgomery became not only the Alabama state capital but also the capital of the infant Confederacy. And the Confederate cabinet set up temporary shop within shouting distance of Lehman Brothers. In 2003, as reported by NPR, the global investment firm Lehman Brothers filed an affidavit with the city of Chicago confirming that in the 1850s it had profited from the slave trade. The company made the admission because Chicago required businesses seeking city contracts to disclose any historical ties to slavery. 3 sons had moved from Alabama to New York City in 1858, where they later helped establish the New York Cotton Exchange in 1870. The same firm that had been built on Alabama cotton, brokered by enslaved labor, went on to become one of the largest investment banks in the world before its collapse in 2008. The trajectory from plantation economy to financial empire was not unusual. It was the pattern. Moses Elias Levy, born in Morocco, established himself as a merchant shipper in the Caribbean, with extensive business dealings in slave trading. He acquired over 100,000 acres in Florida, where he founded Pilgrimage Plantation near Micanopy in the 1820s as a haven for Jews fleeing persecution. The plantation was destroyed during the Second Seminole War in 1835. Levy published a plan for the abolition of slavery in London in 1828, advocating gradual emancipation. His son David Levy Yulee became the first person of Jewish ancestry elected to the United States Senate when Florida gained statehood in 1845. David was an ardent defender of slavery and secession. In 1851, he established a 5,000-acre sugar plantation on the Homosassa River, built and maintained by enslaved African Americans. He used enslaved labor to construct his Florida Railroad, earning him the title Father of Florida's Railroads. His inflammatory pro-slavery rhetoric in the Senate earned him the nickname Florida Fire Eater. Union forces burned his plantation mansion in 1864 after the war. He spent 9 months imprisoned at Fort Pulaski for aiding Confederate President Jefferson Davis's escape. President Andrew Johnson later pardoned him. Uriah Phillips Levy, a United States naval officer, purchased Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate in 1834 for $2,700. He assembled workers including over a dozen enslaved people, whom he purchased to restore and operate the property. He eventually owned about 20 enslaved people during his tenure. Levy used Monticello as a vacation home when not serving in the Navy, where he faced considerable anti-Semitism throughout his career, being court-martialed 6 times. He rose to become the first Jewish Commodore in the United States Navy and was instrumental in abolishing flogging as punishment. His widowed mother Rachel lived at Monticello from 1837 until her death in 1839. She is buried along Mulberry Row, the main plantation street adjacent to the mansion. The broader academic picture was documented by historian and Reform Rabbi Jacob Rader Marcus in his multi-volume History of American Jews. Marcus reported that over 75% of Jewish families in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah owned slaves, and nearly 40% of Jewish households across the South did so. However, Marcus also asserted that Jews were always on the periphery of the slave trade, and that sales of all Jewish traders lumped together did not equal that of the one Gentile firm dominant in the business. Historian Eli Faber of John Jay College reported that in 1790, Charleston's Jews owned a total of 93 slaves, and that perhaps 6 Jewish families lived in Savannah in 1771. The Jewish population in these cities was quite small, so the total number of slaves they owned represented just a small fraction of the total slave population. According to Faber, Jews were more likely than non-Jews to own slaves, but on average they owned fewer of them. Historian Seymour Drescher found that Jewish participation was particularly pronounced in Dutch colonies, where Jews controlled as much as 17% of Dutch Caribbean trade at one point. In Suriname's Joden Savan, or Jewish Savannah, roughly 40 sugarcane plantations housed a Jewish community numbering several hundred up to 9,000 slaves until the area's destruction during an 1832 slave revolt. Nearly all the plantation owners immigrated to Holland afterward, bringing their accumulated wealth with them. British historian Cecil Roth, who served as editor-in-chief of the Encyclopaedia Judaica and wrote over 30 books on Jewish history, documented this community in his work History of the Marranos. Roth wrote that Jews in the Joden Savan were foremost in the suppression of the successive Negro revolts from 1690 to 1722. These revolts, as Roth noted, were largely directed against Jews as being the greatest slaveholders of the region. David Bryan Davis wrote that Jews had no major or continuing impact on the history of New World slavery. Eli Faber's 1998 book was titled Setting the Record Straight, and it was written explicitly as a response to the Nation of Islam's 1991 polemic, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. That polemic took many of the same scholarly sources cited here and wrapped them in a conspiracy framework designed to stoke racial division. Faber's response was necessary, but responses shaped by a specific adversary tend to argue against the extreme position rather than toward the full picture. The earlier scholars had no such adversary. They were writing for their own communities, in their own institutions before the topic became politically weaponized. Bertram W. Korn, a rabbi and historian, delivered his presidential address to the American Jewish Historical Society in 1961 at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Korn stated that Northern Jews were far more active in this aspect of the slave trade than Southern Jews, and that Jewish settlers in the West Indian colonies were at least as influential as those on the North American mainland. Mark Lee Raphael, writing in Jews and Judaism in the United States for the Library of Jewish Studies, documented that in the Dutch colonial congregations of Recife and Mauritia in 1648, community bylaws included an imposta, a Jewish communal tax of 5 soldos for each enslaved person a member purchased from the West India Company. Slave auctions in Dutch Brazil were postponed when they fell on a Jewish holiday. Raphael wrote that in all the American colonies, whether French, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated trade. Roberta Strauss-Feuerleit, a Jewish author, wrote in her 1983 book, The Fate of the Jews, that a disproportionately large number of Jews were slave owners, and that several of these merchants were prominent in their communities. An acting rabbi, the president of a congregation, the 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia, written by Jewish scholars for a Jewish readership at a time when there was no political pressure to minimize, stated under its agriculture entry that during the 17th century the sugar industry was monopolized by the Jews, and that cotton plantations in many parts of the South were wholly in the hands of the Jews. Under its entry on the slave trade, it documented that the trade in slaves constituted the main source of livelihood for the Roman Jews, with papal decrees against the practice issued in 335, 336, 339, 384, 415, 417, 423, 438, and 743. The popes kept issuing bans because the practice kept continuing. These are not hostile sources. These are Jewish historians, rabbis, and encyclopaedists documenting their own community's history in their own publications. When later scholars produced more conservative estimates in the 1990s, they were responding to a polemic, not correcting the earlier community scholarship. The question is not whether one set of scholars is right and the other wrong. The question is whether a defensive response to a bad faith attack should be allowed to overwrite what the community's own historians documented before the topic became untouchable. The documentary record from Korn, Marcus, Raphael, Feuerleit, and the Jewish Encyclopedia stands on its own terms. It was compiled by scholars with no axe to grind. published in institutions with no outside pressure, and it tells a more complete story than the corrective that followed. Elizabeth Donan's 4-volume documents illustrative of the history of the slave trade to America, published by the Carnegie Institute from 1930 to 1935, assembled documents dealing with the slave trade from 1441 through the 18th century. Donan utilized sources from the Royal African Company, the Colonial Office, Spanish archives, and narratives of African voyagers and traders. The work documented participants across all backgrounds engaged in the trade where it was legal and profitable. The pattern was clear. Where slavery existed as a legal institution, people with capital participated regardless of their religious affiliations, national origins, or stated philosophical principles. An 1852 auction notice from Charleston, South Carolina advertised the sale of Negroes, including men, women, boys, and girls, with the auctioneer listed as Abraham Solomons. These were commercial transactions. The buyers and sellers came from every background where commerce was practiced. What mattered was not religion but profit. The system ran on money, and anyone with capital could participate. This uncomfortable truth applies across the board. Christian merchants dominated the trade by sheer numbers. Jewish merchants participated where they had capital and connections. The moral responsibility belongs to everyone who profited from human bondage, regardless of which religious services they attended on their respective Sabbaths. The historiography itself became part of the problem. When the community's own scholars documented participation openly, as Korn did in 1961 and Marcus did across decades of research, when a bad faith polemic weaponized those same findings in 1991, the defensive response did not simply correct the polemic, it narrowed the entire conversation. Topics that had been discussed freely in academic journals and community publications became untouchable. Scholars who cited Korn or Marcus found themselves accused of trafficking in anti-Semitism, even though they were citing a rabbi and a professor of Jewish history. The ad hominem that shielded Hoffman's sources from discussion operated identically here. Discredit the person raising the question, avoid addressing the documentation. The pattern repeats across every dimension of this history. Uncomfortable evidence gets buried not by destroying it, but by making it socially dangerous to mention. The ships themselves were floating death traps. Smith documented that mortality rates varied wildly by voyage and contractor. Under Andrew Reed, some voyages lost over 30% of the human cargo. Captain mortality incentive structures were perverse. The captain received payment based on how many convicts he delivered alive at the halfway point of the voyage, after which financial responsibility transferred to the merchant who bought them. This created an incentive to keep convicts alive for the first half of the journey, then starve them during the second half to save costs. Ship captains calculated that even a 50% death rate still generated profit because the cost of feeding the cargo exceeded the lost revenue from dead freight. Smith documented the case of Captain Bond of the Justitia in 1743, who provided convicts only 1 pint of water per day despite having ample water reserve. Approximately 1/3 of the convicts died during the voyage. Some survivors were so desperate they drank their own urine. Smith noted that some voyages saw 70 to 80% mortality rate. The Virginia Company's own records show that 32 children were thrown into the ocean during a single voyage because they died en route. These were English children being dumped overboard like spoiled cargo, Foster R. Dulles. Writing in Labor in America stated that whether convicts, children spirited from the countryside, or political prisoners, white slaves experienced discomforts and sufferings on their voyage across the Atlantic that paralleled the cruel hardships undergone by Negro slaves on the notorious Middle Passage. Dulles described how whites were indiscriminately herded aboard the White Guyneman, often as many as 300 passengers on little vessels of not more than 200 tons burden. Overcrowded, unsanitary, with mortality rates sometimes as high as 50%, young children seldom survived the horrors of a voyage which might last anywhere from 7 to 12 weeks. Marcus Jernagan documented how the greed of shipmasters compounded the horror. An average cargo was 300, but the shipmaster, for greater profit, would sometimes crowd as many as 600 into a small vessel. The mortality under such circumstances was tremendous, sometimes more than half. B. Ellis, writing in the Argosy, described the conditions below decks, the human cargo, many of whom were still tormented by unhealed wounds, could not all lie down at once without lying on each other. They were never suffered to go on deck. The hatchway was constantly watched by sentinels armed with hangers and blunderbusses. In the dungeons below, Ellis wrote, all was darkness, stench, lamentation, disease, and death. White slaves transported to the colonies were customarily kept below deck for the entire 9 to 12-week journey. A white slave would be confined to a hole not more than 16 feet long, chained with 50 other men to a board, with padlocked collars around their necks. The weeks of confinement in the ship's stifling hold often resulted in outbreaks of contagious disease, which would sweep through the cargo of white freight chained in the bowels of the ship. Who's to Serve Well and Faithfully was published by Cambridge University Press in 1987, provided the comparative mortality data that puts this in context. Salinger wrote on page 91 that scattered data reveal that the mortality for white servants at certain times equaled that for black slaves in the Middle Passage, and during other periods actually exceeded the death rate for black slaves, on page 92. She reported a death rate of 10 to 20% over the entire 18th century for black slaves on board ships en route to America, compared with a death rate of 25% for white slaves en route to America. 25% for whites, 10 to 20 for blacks. The white death rate on the Atlantic crossing was higher. That finding comes from Cambridge University Press, not from a fringe publication. It sits in university libraries, and nobody teaches it. Upon arrival in colonial port, the human merchandise was sold at auction. Salinger also documented that prospective buyers felt muscles, checked teeth like cattle, and examined the cargo as dealers in horses would, looking at teeth and viewing limbs. William Green, an indentured servant who wrote about his experiences, described being searched as dealers in horses do, with buyers checking his teeth and inspecting his body. Marcus Jernagan documented that servants were hurried in droves under custody of severe, brutal drivers. In the shipping manifests, adults were classified as freight and children as half freight, literally valued at half a cargo unit. Think about what this means. The ships arriving in Philadelphia, Annapolis, Alexandria, and Yorktown carried human beings in the hold classified on the cargo manifest the same way you would list barrels of flour or casks of wine. Adults, freight, children, half freight, and the buyers at the dock examined them like you would examine livestock before purchase. The German redemptioner trade added another layer to this system. Over 108,000 German-speaking immigrants came to the Delaware Valley between 1727 and 1835. The journey from the Rhineland ran down the Rhine River through a Dutch port, through British customs, then across the Atlantic. The total transit took 2 to 8 months. Families sold everything they owned to pay for passage, only to discover upon arrival that the cost had been doubled or tripled. Unable to pay, they became redemptioners, meaning they had to find someone to redeem their passage debt or be sold at auction. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, soul drivers, marched groups of unsold redemptioners from town to town in the Pennsylvania backcountry, selling them piecemeal like a traveling livestock market. Gottlieb Mittelberg, who made the voyage in 1750, documented the terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, and high child mortality aboard the redemptioner ships. He described how 32 children were thrown into the ocean during one voyage because they died en route. This is the same figure that appears in Virginia Company records from the 1620s. Child mortality on these voyages was so routine that captains kept a tally the way you would count damaged goods. Mortality on German redemptioner ships averaged under 4% overall, much better than the convict ships. But individual voyages could see 10 to 20% death rates. Upon arrival, redemptioners were paraded along Market Street wharves in Philadelphia for physical inspection by prospective buyers. Passage debt typically amounted to 10 to 20 pounds. Healthier adults aged 15 to 25 with marketable skills negotiated 3 to 5 year contracts. Those who went unredeemed were sold at auction by ship captains to the soul drivers. Bernard Balin mapped the trading circuits of soul drivers in the Virginia backcountry, who drove servants as far inland as the Bedford County Courthouse. Over 100 miles from the coast, the German Society of Pennsylvania was founded on December 26, 1764, when 65 men met in a Lutheran schoolhouse in Philadelphia specifically to address the horrors experienced by German immigrants. That society exists to this day, one of the oldest immigrant aid organizations in America. Founded because the abuses were so systematic and so severe that the German community had to organize collective defense. Now consider what Smith documented about plantation life. The people who built this system have names. Abraham Piercy, the Cape merchant who served as chief supply officer for the Virginia colony, was among the first to purchase enslaved Africans when 20 arrived in 1619 aboard the White Line. Sir George Yearley, the colonial governor, and Captain William Pierce also bought human beings from that first shipment. These men established the template. Piercy accumulated significant wealth through his position, controlling trade and purchasing both white servants and black slaves. His household at Floredo 100 Plantation became one of the colony's major operations. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia, English law had not yet enshrined race-based slavery. The records from 1624 and 1635 described these people as servants, the same term used for white-bound laborers. The distinction had not yet hardened into law, but the practice was already established. The legal code in Virginia by 1705 prescribed that white Christian servants could not be whipped naked without an order from a justice of the peace. That sounds like a protection until you realize what it implies. Masters could whip servants clothed at will, anytime, for any reason. They only needed a justice's permission to strip them naked first. Where free persons were punishable by fine, servants were punished by whipping at the rate of 20 lashes for every 500 pounds of tobacco or 50 shillings. The conversion rate between human flesh and tobacco was legally codified. Freedom dues for male servants in Virginia included 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings or equivalent, a gun worth 20 shillings, and 50 acres of land. That last provision, 50 acres, sounds generous until you understand the context. By the 1660s and 1670s, the headright system had been massively exploited. Edmund Morgan documented that during those decades, the number of headrights claimed was approximately 4 times greater than the actual increase in population. Some patents claimed importation of a person the second time or the third time, and one case showed the same individual claimed 6 times. This fraud allowed massive land accumulation by elites. When freedmen were finally entitled to their 50 acres, they discovered all the good land was already claimed by the planter class. The promise was empty. The 50 acres existed only in the statute books, not on the ground. The result was a growing class of landless freedmen, poor whites with no prospects. Angry at the system and dangerous to social order, Morgan calculated that by 1670, the colony had restricted voting to landowners only, disenfranchising this entire class. These men had survived their indentures, barely, only to discover they had no future. They could not vote, could not acquire land, could not marry because they could not support a family. They became a volatile, resentful underclass that the planter elite feared. That fear became reality in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. The rebellion involved the plundering of planter estates by the colony's poor. Bacon's forces included former white servants, freedmen, even enslaved Africans who joined the uprising. For a brief moment, the colony's entire underclass united against the elite. Edmund Morgan's analysis of that rebellion and its aftermath, which we will examine in detail, transformed how historians understand American race relations before 1660. The boundaries between white servants and black slaves were porous. They ate and slept together, made common cause in running away, and engaged in sexual relations. The very existence of laws against interracial cooperation demonstrates it was occurring regularly enough to alarm the authorities. Conspiracies involving white and black servants planning rebellion together were documented in York County in 1661 and Gloucester County in 1663. The authorities treated these as acts of war. After Bacon's Rebellion, everything changed. Virginia began the systematic legal separation of white and black, creating racism as state policy. And the white servant trade began its long decline as Virginia switched to African slavery as its primary labor source. Not because slavery was more profitable than servitude, but because enslaved Africans could never become poor white freedmen who might vote, organize, or rebel. They could be kept permanently subjugated in ways that English servants could not. This is what Abbott Emerson Smith documented across 435 pages. And these are only the highlights. He recorded ship names, captain names, merchant house ledgers, county court proceedings, and statistical tables that show the full scope of the system. Hoffman cited Smith's work, used fragments of it, but barely touched what Smith actually compiled. The full record sits in university libraries gathering dust, too detailed, too documented, too undeniable to fit the sanitized narrative taught in schools today. Edmund Morgan revealed why Virginia's rulers switched to African slavery. Edmund S. Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom was published in 1975 and won the National Book Award. The book transformed how historians understand the relationship between liberty and bondage in America. Morgan's central argument is that American freedom and American slavery were not contradictory but complementary. Virginia, which owned 40% of all enslaved people at the time of the Revolution, produced the Revolution's leading spokesmen for liberty: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, all slave owners, all from Virginia, all demanding freedom from British tyranny while holding human beings in chains. Morgan asked how this happened. The answer lies in what happened to white servants in the 17th century. Morgan compiled devastating mortality statistics. Of the 7,549 people sent to Virginia between 1607 and 1624, only 95 were still alive by the 1625 census. That is an 85% death rate across 17 years. Think about that. 85% of every 100 people shipped to Virginia. 85 were dead within 2 decades. During the starving time of 1609 to 1610, about 3/4 of colonists in the fort perished. Of 240 people in November, only about 60 survived to May. These are not statistics from some remote jungle expedition. This is English people in an English colony growing tobacco for English merchants. The death rate was worse than the trenches of World War I. It was worse than the worst plague outbreaks. Yet the ships kept coming, year after year, delivering more human cargo to replace the dead. Morgan documented specific cases of servant abuse that reveal the system's brutality beyond mere statistics. Captain John and Alice Proctor appear in general court testimony from October 10, 1624. Alice Proctor arranged for her runaway maidservant Elizabeth Abbott to be beaten so severely that Abbott died. A servant named Elias Hinton also died at the Proctor's hands, with both cases heard together. On July 31, 1649, the Lower Norfolk County Court considered depositions about the mistreatment of servant Charity Dallin by her mistress Deborah Fernahaw, who had thrashed her more like a dog than a Christian, leaving her head as soft as a sponge in one place, and her back possibly broken. These cases came to court, which means they were the exceptions. Most murders of servants never saw a courtroom. Maryland court records from the 1650s and 60s show a pattern. Henry Smith beat an elderly male servant to death, raped 2 female servants, no consequences. John Dandy beat a boy to death, body found in a creek, no consequences. Thomas Bradnox beat his servant to death in 1658, found guilty, pardoned. Pope Alvey beat Alice Sanford to a jelly in 1663, found guilty, pardoned. Joseph Fincher beat Jeffrey Hagman to death in 1664, found guilty, pardoned. The pattern repeats: guilty, pardoned, guilty, pardoned. The courts knew these were murders. They convicted the masters, then the governor pardoned them. The message was clear. A master could kill a servant and walk free. Morgan also documented the case of Jane Dickinson, which shows how the system treated even free women who got caught in its machinery. Jane was a servant living on Martin's 100 plantation with her husband Ralph when the Powhatan attacked in 1622. Ralph was killed. Jane was held prisoner for 10 months. Dr. John Pott, the Jamestown physician and future Virginia governor, ransomed her for 2 pounds of beads. Then Pott claimed she owed him the remaining time on her dead husband's contract plus reimbursement for the ransom. On March 30, 1624, Dickinson petitioned the court, saying Pott's treatment much differeth not from her slavery with the Indians. The woman had been held captive by Indians for 10 months. Her husband was dead, and an English doctor claimed he now owned her as property. She said outright that English servitude was no different from her slavery with the Indians. That testimony is in the court record. Think about what this means for the comfortable narrative that indentured servitude was somehow benign compared to racial slavery. Jane Dickinson, an Englishwoman, told a Virginia court that her treatment as a white servant was the same as her treatment as an Indian captive. The court records contain her words. Nobody disputes the document exists. Yet this testimony rarely appears in textbooks. The servant's life had no value. The master's property rights were absolute. Morgan's analysis of Bacon's rebellion revealed exactly why the shift to African slavery occurred. As Smith documented, The Hildreth fraud had created what Morgan called a contrived scarcity of land. By 1670, Virginia had a growing population of landless freedmen who had survived their indentures only to discover all the accessible land was already patented to the wealthy. As we saw in Smith's account, the rebellion united the entire underclass, white and black. When Governor Berkeley finally crushed the rebellion with the help of British troops, the planters faced a terrifying question: how do you prevent this from happening again? Morgan's answer is the key to understanding American racial history. His crucial insight was that resentment of an alien race might be more powerful than resentment of an upper class. The answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism. To separate dangerous free whites from dangerous slave blacks by a screen of racial contempt. After 1676, Virginia law increasingly distinguished between white and black, servant and slave, Christian and heathen. White freedmen were given not only permission to prosper, but also social, psychological, and political advantages. Poor whites were granted membership in the ruling race. They might be poor, they might be landless, they might be exploited, but they were white. And that meant something. It meant they were better than black. That distinction turned the thrust of exploitation away from them and aligned them with their exploiters. This was not natural evolution. This was deliberate policy before Bacon's rebellion. Virginia statutes rarely distinguished between white and black servants. Both ran away together. Both faced similar punishments. Both were described as servants. The 1640 case of the three servants belonging to Hugh Gwynn shows the transition beginning. Victor, a Dutchman, James Gregory, a Scotchman, and John Punch ran away to Maryland together and were captured. The white servants were whipped and had 4 years added to their indentures. John Punch, the African, was sentenced to serve for the time of his natural life. That is the first documented legal distinction between European and African unfree workers in the English colonies. Hugh Gwynn owned all three, but Virginia law began treating them differently based on origin. By 1705, the distinction was absolute. The Comprehensive Act concerning servants and slaves divided Virginia's labor force into two distinct legal categories with completely different rights. Punishments and futures. Servants could gain freedom. Slaves could not. Servants could sue. Slaves could not. Servants had defined terms. Slaves were property forever. And the skin color line hardened into law. Don Jordan and Michael Walsh uncovered the machinery of kidnapping. Don Jordan and Michael Walsh's White Cargo, published in 2007, runs across 19 chapters tracking the trade from the 1590s through American independence. The book opens with Sir John Popham, Lord Chief Justice of England and former highwayman, who drew up the Vagrancy Act legislation and planned to empty the Gaels to America. Popham reasoned that England's surplus population, the vagabonds, beggars, and petty criminals filling the jails, could be shipped to Virginia where they would enrich the kingdom through production of tobacco and other commodities. Sir Thomas Smythe, reputedly England's richest man, masterminded the Virginia Company and was instrumental in organizing the mass expulsion of children. Jordan and Walsh documented that in 1618, the first 100 street children, ages 8 to 16, were swept up from London streets and shipped to Virginia for tobacco field labor. The City of London's Common Council formally appointed 100 children out of their superfluous multitude to be transported. This was presented to the public as an act of charity for starving children, giving them a new start as apprentices in America. In reality, the children were sold to planters upon arrival, and half were dead within a year. The Virginia Company complained to Sir Robert Naunton, principal secretary to King James I, that the children were unwilling to go. The English Privy Council then granted the Virginia Company permission to force the children onto ships, authorizing officials to imprison, punish, and dispose any of those children who resisted. Royal authority compelled 8-year-olds onto ships against their will. A wife of one man who imported 4 Irish boys into Maryland in 1661 wondered why he had not brought some cradles to have rocked them in. As they were so little, the children were so young they needed to be rocked to sleep. Yet they were in Maryland as bound laborers. One extraordinary archaeological find Jordan and Walsh discuss is a teenage boy's skeleton excavated in 2003 outside Annapolis from a 17th century site. The boy, who died around the 1660s at approximately age 16, showed evidence of tuberculosis, a fearful mouth infection, and herniated discs from years of hard physical toil. He was Northern European, probably English. He had been buried under household waste in a cellar, thrown out with the rubbish when he died. They dumped his body in the trash pit. He was worth so little to his master that disposal of the corpse was handled the same way you would discard broken pottery. The authors provide detailed data on the post-1718 convict trade economics. Remember the definition: salability, coercion, violence, loss of legal personhood. A convict servant cost half the price of an enslaved African, and they were sold in the same markets. Male enslaved persons sold for 35 to 44 pounds. Male convicts sold for under 13 pounds. Women convicts went for 7 to 10 pounds. Semi-skilled convicts brought 7 to 14 pounds. And skilled convicts commanded 15 to 25 pounds. The price differential drove the trade. If you needed labor and could not afford 40 pounds for an enslaved African, you bought a convict for 12 pounds. The life expectancy was shorter, but the initial investment was lower. Planters calculated the economics cold-bloodedly, worked them to death, buy another one. Jordan and Walsh traced the Cromwellian deportations in detail. Oliver Cromwell's conquest of Ireland from 1649 to 1653 was genocidal in scale. Forced deportations of Irish did not begin in earnest until May 1653. Scholarly estimates cluster around 10,000 to 12,000 total forcibly deported during the Cromwellian era. Sir William Petty, who served as Henry Cromwell's secretary, estimated that 6,000 women and boys were sent into slavery to the plantations. These were not criminals. These were defeated enemies, prisoners of war, civilians from rebellious towns. The specific case of David Selleck, a prominent tobacco merchant from Boston, is fully documented. On September 6, 1653, a warrant was issued to transport 400 Irish children to New England and Virginia. The ships Providence and Goodfellow carried these captives. The Providence sold its cargo at Rappahannock, Virginia, for tobacco. The Goodfellow, under Master George Dell, sold captives in New England. Samuel Simons purchased 2 of them, William Downing and Philip Welch, on May 10, 1654 for 9 years of service. On June 27, 1661, Downing and Welch appeared before Salem Quarterly Court in Massachusetts, testifying they were brought out of our own country, contrary to our own wills and minds. Another witness, John King, testified that others were stolen in Ireland by some of the English soldiers in the night out of their beds. Soldiers entered homes in Ireland, took children from their beds, and shipped them to Massachusetts to be sold. This is documented in Massachusetts court records. These are legal depositions from witnesses under oath. Peter Wilson Coldham spent 15 years building the largest record of forced emigrants ever compiled. Peter Wilson Coldham worked at the British Public Records Office and spent over 15 years compiling what became the largest and most complete passenger list of its kind ever published. His complete book of emigrants in bondage contains over 50,000 records of Englishmen, women, and children sentenced to deportation. With his 1992 supplement and 2002 follow-up, the total reaches approximately 59,000 entries. That is nearly 60,000 individual people, each with a name, a place of origin, a crime, a sentence, and a destination. Each entry includes, where available, the person's surname and Christian name with aliases, parish of origin, occupation or status, sentencing court and offense, month and year of sentence, month, year and ship of transport, and place of landing in America. Coldham consulted the minutes of 11 courts of assize and jail delivery, 28 courts of quarter sessions, Treasury papers, money books, patent rolls, state papers, and in over 50 courts total. This was archival research at its most exhaustive. He compiled the names the system tried to forget. Coldham documented exactly how the process worked. Convicts were marched chained together through London streets from Newgate Prison down to Blackfriars at the Thames to board ships. Crowds watched the spectacle. The keeper of Newgate charged 14 shillings and 10 pence per convict discharged for transportation. Even the jailer extracted a fee. Lists of transported criminals were sometimes available for purchase by the public. You could buy a printed list of this month's deportees, the way you might buy a newspaper. The Bristol firm of Stevenson, Randolph and Cheston had standing orders to supply plantation owners with convicts months before ships even arrived. The plantation owners sent letters specifying how many workers they needed, what skills were preferred, and the firm guaranteed delivery. Convicts were sold on the decks of ships, with buyers shown conviction papers listing their crime, sentence length, and jail details. The Maryland Gazette advertised upcoming auctions of imported convicts in the same section as sales of furniture and livestock. Coldham also published without indentures an index to white slave children in colonial court records of Maryland and Virginia. A scholar named Richard Hayes Phillips compiled an index of over 5,000 names of children from colonial court order books who arrived without indentures and were bound by courts. 5,000 children appear in court records because they arrived in the colony with no documentation, no contract, no legal status. The courts examined them, assigned them to masters, and recorded the transaction. These children were property. Their labor belonged to whoever the court awarded them to, typically until age 24 for males or age 21 for females. The sheer scale of what Coldham documented is overwhelming. Ship manifests, court orders, Treasury payments. This is not speculation or theory. These are names and dates compiled from government archives. The British government kept records because they paid contractors per head delivered. The colonial courts kept records because property transactions had to be registered. The evidence exists because the system was bureaucratic, organized, and legal. They wrote everything down, and virtually none of it appears in textbooks about colonial America. A reminder of what we mean by slavery in this context, because the word matters. We are not using it loosely. We mean people who were bought and sold as property, people subjected to violence up to and including death with minimal legal consequence for their owners, people who appeared on cargo manifests as freight, people whose children could be sold separately, people who were inspected like livestock before purchase. The term of bondage was limited, but the condition of bondage for every day of that term met every definition of slavery except permanence. That is what the court records. The shipping manifests, the statute books, and the eyewitness accounts document. That is what the scholars found. The Webbs and related sources documented the death factories feeding the colonial trade. Sidney and Beatrice Webb's English Poor Law History was published as part of their English Local Government series in 1922. The book documented the institutional machinery that produced servants for colonial export. The 1601 Poor Relief Act authorized church wardens and overseers to bind any such children as apprentices until such man-child shall come to the age of 4 and 20 years. This was the legal mechanism by which children were bound out, including to colonial masters. Parish officials had legal authority to seize poor children and ship them anywhere they chose, including across the Atlantic, and the child had no legal recourse. Jonas Hanway calculated mortality statistics for London parish workhouses in the 1760s. In 1763-64, in one London parish, 86% of parish infants died in their first year. 86%. Nearly 9 out of every 10 babies placed in parish care died before their first birthday. By 1763-65, the overall mortality rate for children in the care of London poor law authorities exceeded 90%. After Hanway's reforms, mortality dropped below 25% by 1778, demonstrating how catastrophic the previous system had been. The 90% death rate was not natural or unavoidable. It was the result of deliberate neglect. Nearly 2/3 of all children in London, rich and poor combined, died before their 5th birthday at the peak in the mid-18th century. For parish children specifically, the rate was worse. They were dying at rates that exceeded the Black Death. St. Pancras Workhouse, designed for about 50 inmates, held 450 by 1787, half of whom were children. They were packed 9 to a room designed for 1. The case of Robert Blincoe illustrates what this meant in practice. Blincoe was born around 1792 and orphaned into St. Pancras Workhouse by age 4. In August 1799, 80 boys and girls, all 7 years old, were indentured as parish apprentices to Messrs. Lambert's cotton spinners at Lowdham Mill near Nottingham. The children were told they would be fed on roast beef and plum pudding and ride their masters' horses. This was how parish officials convinced children to go voluntarily. Blincoe was later transferred to Lytton Mill, owned by Ellis Needham. The reality was horrific. A blacksmith named Palfrey worked nearby and would pound on the floor of his shop yelling, "For shame, are you murdering the children?" He could hear the screaming. Named overseers who brutalized the children included Woodward, Merrick, and Charnock. A girl named Mary Richards, not quite 10 years of age, was horrifically injured by a drawing frame near a horizontal shaft. Her injuries were so severe, they cannot be described in polite company. Blincoe later published his memoir in 1832, and it became one of the sources Charles Dickens drew upon for Oliver Twist. Dickens did not invent the horrors of the workhouse system, he documented them. 4 years after Blincoe's memoir, in 1836, a Harvard-educated historian and journalist named Richard Hildreth published what is now considered the first anti-slavery novel in American literature. The Slave, or Memoir of Archie Moore, later expanded and retitled The White Slave, or Memoirs of a Fugitive in 1852, tells the story of a man born to a white planter father and an enslaved mother who was herself the daughter of a white planter. He and his sister could pass as white, one of the book's illustrations, captioned Trial of Affection on page 65, depicts a white-appearing man strung up by his wrists and stripped, his woman forced to stand and watch the punishment. 2 men in broad-brimmed, Puritan-style hats direct the scene. A black man stands freely to the right, fully clothed, observing without distress. The composition places a white body as the object of brutality and black man as spectator. In 1836, that image inverted every assumption. Hildreth wrote the novel after spending over a year on a Florida plantation where he witnessed conditions firsthand. No publisher would touch it. He later wrote that the servile publishers of that day would not risk it, and that printers were almost afraid to set up the types. So complete was the reign of terror around the subject that the first anti-slavery novel in American history had to be forced into existence against the resistance of the entire publishing industry. It eventually became an international bestseller, translated into French as Les Clefs Blancs, with multiple editions in London and Paris in 1852 and 1853. It predated Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin by 16 years. After the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, Hildreth joined the Boston Vigilance Committee, which assisted freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. The National Park Service documents his membership and a payment of $100 for unspecified law services in July 1851. He died in Florence, Italy, in 1865 with many works unfinished. Today, Uncle Tom's Cabin is taught in every American literature curriculum. The White Slave is not taught at all. The University of North Carolina's Documenting the American South project hosts the text and illustrations online, but catalogs the trial of affection illustration under African Americans, punishment, and torture. Even though the figure being tortured in the image appears white, the first anti-slavery novel in American literature depicted white slavery. The modern library catalog cannot process what its own illustration shows. The Privy Council correspondence about the 1619 and 1620 child shipments to Virginia survives in the records of the Virginia Company of London. The company complained to Sir Robert Naunton that London street children were unwilling to be sent to Virginia. They resisted, they fought, they refused. The company's letter states that the City of London had by act of their Common Council appointed 100 children out of their superfluous multitude to be transported. The children would not go willingly, so the English Privy Council granted the Virginia Company permission to force the children onto ships, authorizing officials to imprison, punish, and dispose any of those children who resisted. The Privy Council, the highest executive authority under the king, ordered that children be imprisoned and compelled onto ships by force if they would not go voluntarily. Of approximately 250 destitute children transported from London to Virginia between 1617 and 1623, the survival rate was catastrophic. 300 children transported between 1619 and 1622 left only 12 still alive by 1624. That is a 96% death rate over 2 years. Out of 300 children sent to Virginia, 288 were dead within 2 years. This is not a plague or a battle. This is systematic destruction of children through forced labor in deadly conditions. Sharon Salinger documented how Philadelphia's servant market actually operated. Sharon Salinger's To Serve Well and Faithfully was published in 1987 by Cambridge University Press. The book focused specifically on Pennsylvania from 1682 to 1800. Pennsylvania's system differed from Virginia because it centered on urban Philadelphia rather than rural plantations. Servants worked for artisans in craft production, merchant retailers, and domestic service. This should have made conditions better. Urban work was supposedly less deadly than plantation tobacco labor. Yet the system was still brutal. Salinger documented that combined slaves and servants constituted about 1/3 of the labor force in mid-18th century Philadelphia. Slaves peaked at slightly over 20% of the workforce in the 1730s. Bound citizens fell from 17% to 6.40% of Philadelphia's population during the American Revolution. This means that at its peak, 1 in 5 workers in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, the Quaker city, the city founded on principles of religious tolerance and human dignity, was enslaved. Another 1 in 7 was an indentured servant. Over 1/3 of the labor force was unfree. Think about walking through Philadelphia in 1750. Every third person you passed was someone's property. The baker's apprentice grinding flour, the merchant's clerk copying ledgers, the household servant carrying water. 1/3 of them were bound, unable to leave, unable to refuse, subject to corporal punishment at their master's discretion. This was not the South. This was Pennsylvania, founded by Quakers who believed in the inner light of God in every person. Richard Morris extracted 20,000 court cases from colonial records. Richard B. Morris's Government and Labor in Early America was published in 1946 and runs to 577 pages based on over a decade of research. Morris extracted accounts of 20,000 court cases from county records across all 13 colonies, plus contemporary newspapers, diaries, and correspondence. 20,000 cases. That is an extraordinary sample size. From those 20,000 cases, Morris documented what he called the leniency with which murder and torture of unfree workers, men and women, was treated by the court. Morris confirmed the pattern already documented in Morgan's Virginia research, but his 20,000 case sample revealed it was not limited to one colony. The guilty then pardoned cycle that characterized the Bradnocks, Alvey, and Fincher cases in Maryland repeated across all 13 colonies. The message to servants was clear: your master can kill you. The message to masters was equally clear: you will not hang for killing your servant. Morris documented runaways and the punishments they faced. A Virginia woman ran away while pregnant. Recaptured, 2 years added for running, 2 years added for the pregnancy. Because the time she was pregnant was time she was not working, 4 additional years total. A Maryland servant caught running had 7 years added to his original 7-year term. His offense doubled his bondage. Branding with hot irons on the face or hand was common. Public whipping was routine. The brutality was not exceptional, it was policy. Morris also documented breeding operations. The dimension of slavery most people assume applied only to Africans. Masters forced female servants to have children, then sold the children to other planters. Virginia court records from 1740 contain a newspaper advertisement for a white servant woman for sale. Breeding, the ad specifically noted her capacity to produce children. She was being sold as breeding stock. Morris found dozens of such cases in court records and newspapers. The practice was not hidden. It was advertised openly. Warren B. Smith traced how South Carolina imported the Barbados model. Warren B. Smith's White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina was published in 1961 and documented how that colony was called a colony. South Carolina was founded in 1670 by settlers from overcrowded Barbados. Over the first 3 years, more than half of white settlers and enslaved Africans came from Barbados. 7 of the first 21 governors were Barbadian or had close Barbadian ties. South Carolina's slave code was modeled on Barbados and was the harshest on the continent. Smith included the complete text of the 1717 Act for the Better Governing and Regulating White Servants as an appendix. That statute codified punishments for runaways. South Carolina law prescribed amputation as punishment for recaptured freedom seekers. Females could have ears cut off, males could have testicles removed. This was the law. Not a proposal, not a threat, but the law as enacted by the colonial legislature and approved by the governor and enforced for decades. Rice became as important in South Carolina as sugar in Barbados. Colonial travelers described Carolina rice fields as charnel houses. The death rate rivaled the Sugar Islands. By 1708, for the first time in any North American colony, the black population outnumbered the white. South Carolina became a slave society earlier than Virginia, and it was more brutal from the start. The scholarly sources document servant resistance far beyond what Hoffman included. The 1661 York County conspiracy involved 40 servants who conspired to rebel over lack of meat in their diets. The leaders were Isaac Friend and William Clutton, both servants of Major James Goodwin. Friend proposed they get about 40 of them together, get arms, and march through the countryside crying, who would be for liberty and free from bondage. Thomas T. Collins testified about the conspiracy. Another conspirator, William Cheshire, said he would be one. They were planning armed rebellion against their masters. The 1663 Gloucester County conspiracy was more organized and more severely punished. 9 named conspirators planned to meet at midnight at Poplar Spring, each bringing weapons. They intended to march first to the home of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Willis to seize his weapons, then to Governor Berkeley's Green Spring mansion to demand release from indentures after 1 year instead of 7. The named conspirators were John Gunter, William Bell, Richard Derbyshire, John Haight, Thomas Jones, William Ball, William Pulteney, William Bendel, and Thomas Collins. The group was multi-ethnic, including English, Irish, African, and Indian servants, alongside convict laborers. A servant named John Birkenhead betrayed the plot. This was the first time colonial authorities treated servant rebellion as an act of war rather than merely a labor dispute. 4 conspirators were hanged and beheaded. Their heads were displayed on pikes as a warning. Birkenhead received his freedom, plus 5,000 pounds of tobacco for his betrayal. The Virginia General Assembly passed Act 14, establishing September 13th as a perpetual holiday commemorating suppression of the conspiracy. Virginia celebrated a holiday marking the execution of servants who demanded freedom. That holiday was celebrated annually until the Revolution. These conspiracies terrified the planters because they crossed racial lines. White servants, black slaves, Irish convicts, and Indian workers plotted together. They spoke of liberty. They planned to arm themselves. They intended to demand freedom. The authorities crushed them with overwhelming force and made sure everyone remembered what happened to servants who demanded their rights. What the eyewitnesses actually wrote. The eyewitness testimony in these scholarly sources goes far beyond the handful of quotes Hoffman used. Richard Frethorn, an indentured servant at Martin's Hundred near Jamestown, wrote to his parents on March 20, 1623, "Since I came out of the ship, I never ate anything but peas and loblolly, which was water gruel. As for deer or venison, I never saw any since I came into this land." 2/3 of his fellow shipmates had already died since arrival. Goodman Jackson much marveled that you would send me a servant to the company, Frethorn wrote. "He saith I had been better knocked on the head. Better to have been killed in England than sent to Virginia." Frethorn was dead within 2 years of writing that letter. The Dutchman David Peterson de Vries, visiting Virginia in March 1633, wrote that he was astonished to observe of the English people that they lose their servants in gambling with each other. He told them he had never seen such work in Turk or barbarian, and that it was not becoming Christians. A Dutch merchant observed English colonists gambling with human beings as stakes, and said even the Turks and barbarians did not do such things. This is how English Christians treated English Christians in Virginia. Elizabeth Spriggs wrote from Maryland to her father on September 22, 1756. "What we unfortunate English people suffer here is beyond the probability of you in England to conceive." She described brutal labor, inadequate food, and savage beatings. Her letter survives in the archives. Duncan Campbell, the convict transport contractor whose ships we documented earlier, admitted under oath to Parliament that over 14% of felons died on each voyage. A man profiting from the system confirmed the death rate as routine. Benjamin Franklin called the convict transportation an insult and contempt, the cruelest perhaps that ever one people offered another. He suggested America should export rattlesnakes to England in return. Franklin was not known for hyperbole, the numbers that tell the real story, taken together. These scholarly sources document a system of extraordinary scale and brutality. Approximately 300,000 white people were shipped to America as servants between the early 17th century and the Revolution. 50,000 to 60,000 of those were convicts. 10,000 to 12,000 Irish were forcibly deported under Cromwell alone. Over 5,000 names of white child servants appear in colonial court records of Maryland and Virginia. Children who arrived without indentures and were assigned to masters by court order. 59,000 individual convict transportation records survive in Coldham's compilations. And Richard Morris found 20,000 court cases documenting the legal framework that held the entire system together. The establishment's own scholars, working in the establishment's own archives, documented all of this. Hoffman cited their names. He used fragments of their work, but the full record they compiled, the thousands of names, the ship manifests, the court proceedings, the mortality figures, the eyewitness accounts, remains largely unread, buried in academic volumes that most people will never open. The sources are there. The documentation is overwhelming. The evidence is undeniable. So why does nobody know about it? What they teach you. The slave trade was primarily a Southern institution run by a specific group of people. What the sources show, the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery involved merchants, ship owners, auctioneers, and financiers from every region and every background where commercial activity existed. Newport, Rhode Island sent 347 slave ships to Africa. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia all had active slave markets. Northern merchants financed Southern plantations. The complexity of who participated gets simplified into convenient narratives. Aaron Lopez, a Jewish refugee from the Inquisition who helped found the first synagogue in the colonies, also financed slave ships. William Vernon, a Christian merchant who played a key role in the Continental Congress's maritime activities during the Revolution, was perhaps Newport's most prolific slave trader. Abraham Percy, the Anglican Cape merchant of Virginia, bought the first Africans to arrive in 1619. The system crossed all boundaries. It was commercial, not sectarian. Yet the historical narrative tends to simplify these complexities. The uncomfortable truth is that wherever there was profit, people participated, regardless of their own history of persecution or their stated religious values. Pointing this out is not an attack on any group. It is recognition that the capacity for exploitation was universal when economic incentives aligned. The moral failing belongs to everyone who participated, and the responsibility for teaching the full truth belongs to historians who continue to simplify what the documents actually show. What they teach you versus what the documents show. Walk into any American high school history class and ask about colonial labor. The teacher will tell you about indentured servitude. The textbook will have a paragraph, maybe two. It will explain that poor Europeans voluntarily signed contracts to work for a period of years, typically 7, in exchange for passage to America at the end of their term. They received freedom dues and started new lives. Some became successful. The system was portrayed as tough but fair, a pathway to opportunity. Fundamentally different from slavery. Then the textbook moves on to African slavery, which receives chapter after chapter of detailed coverage. The middle passage, the auction block, the plantation, the resistance, the abolition movement. Students learn about the scale, the brutality, the injustice. They learn that slavery was America's original sin. They learn the names of slave ships, slave traders, plantation owners. They see images of shackles and whips. They read slave narratives. The curriculum treats African slavery as the central moral question of American history. Now compare that to what the scholars actually documented, what they teach you. Indentured servitude was a voluntary labor contract, what the sources show. The evidence already presented speaks for itself. 600 to 700 children kidnapped from Aberdeen. Kidnapping gangs operating from inside St. Paul's Cathedral. Children as young as 8 seized from London streets by official municipal order. Coldham's 59,000 names of people sentenced to transportation, plus 5,000 child servants who arrived without documentation. These are not volunteer. These are property, what they teach you. Servants signed contracts for about 7 years and then were free, what the sources show. As Morris documented, running away could double your bondage. Pregnancy added years because a pregnant woman was not working. Masters bred female servants deliberately and advertised them as breeding stock. Children born to servant mothers inherited their mother's status and could be sold separately. Multi-generational bondage was legal and practiced. The 7-year term was fiction for many. And even if you survived to freedom, the headright fraud meant the 50 acres promised as freedom dues did not actually exist in any usable form. You got freedom and no land and no prospects, what they teach you. Servants were treated humanely because they were Christians and their masters were Christians. What the sources show, you have already heard the numbers. 85% dead in Virginia in under 2 decades. 96% of children dead in 2 years. 70 to 80% mortality on some ships, with dead children thrown overboard like spoiled goods. A teenage boy worked to death at 16 and buried in a trash pit with household waste. Masters who beat servants to death, found guilty, then pardoned. Jane Dickinson telling a Virginia court that English servitude was the same as Indian captivity. Richard Frethorn writing that he had been better knocked on the head than sent to Virginia. David Peterson DeVries saying that English colonists gambling with servants was something not even Turks and barbarians would do. Humanity? This was systematic destruction, what they teach you. African slavery was fundamentally different from indentured servitude because slaves were property and servants were not. What the sources show, the evidence has been presented in detail. Servants appeared in estate inventories alongside livestock and furniture. Shipping manifests classified them as freight and half-freight. Buyers inspected them like horses. Sole drivers marched them from town to town. The Bristol firm of Stevenson Randolph in Cheston took standing orders for convict workers the way you would order lumber. The difference between servant and slave was the term of bondage, not the nature of the bondage. During the term of service, a servant was property, temporary property versus permanent property. That was the only distinction, what they teach you. The colonial labor system was primarily about African slavery, with indentured servitude as a minor footnote. What the sources show. Smith's statistics bear repeating in summary. White servants outnumbered black slaves nearly 3-to-1 in the 17th century. Even in the 18th century, over 100,000 white servants still arrived. Between half and two-thirds of all white immigrants to colonial America arrived in bondage. This was not a footnote. This was the system. And as Morgan documented, Virginia switched from white servants to black slaves not because slavery was more profitable, but because enslaved Africans could never become angry freedmen who might vote, organize, or rebel. White freedom was built on black slavery, and both were built on the corpse pile of the white servant trade that came before. What they teach you, the Founding Fathers fought for liberty and freedom. What the sources show. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison all owned slaves. But they also benefited from a system that had previously worked hundreds of thousands of white servants to death in the same fields. The ideology of liberty they articulated was developed by a planter class that had spent the previous century and a half exploiting white and black labor with equal brutality. Virginia, which produced the Revolution's greatest spokesman for freedom, had the longest and deadliest history of bound labor in North America. Morgan's central insight was that American freedom and American slavery were not contradictory. They were complementary. The liberty of the planter class rested on the bondage of their workers. The Declaration of Independence was written by slave owners. The Constitution was written by slave owners. And the system they built preserved the power of the class that had gotten rich working people to death. White and black, for over a century, what they teach you. America is a nation of immigrants who came seeking opportunity, what the sources show. Between 1607 and 1776, approximately 300,000 white people were shipped to America in bondage. 50 to 60,000 were convicts. 10 to 12,000 were Irish prisoners of war forcibly deported by Cromwell. 600 to 700 were children kidnapped from Aberdeen. 100 were London street children seized by municipal order. 5,000 were orphan children who arrived without documentation and were assigned to masters by courts. Over 100,000 were German redemptioners who arrived to discover their passage debt had been tripled, and they would be sold if family could not pay. Thousands were kidnapped by spirits working the docks and streets of British cities. They did not come seeking opportunity, they were cargo, they came in chains. They died in the fields, and the ones who survived were thrown into trash pits when they were no longer useful. This was not immigration, this was deportation, kidnapping, and human trafficking on an industrial scale, what they teach you. Slavery is an institution that applied to Africans, what the sources show. The word slave was used by contemporaries to describe white-bound laborers. Richard Lygon's 1657 account of Barbados explicitly called them white slaves. The Maryland and Virginia court records used slave and servant interchangeably in the 1630s and 1640s. Jane Dickinson used the word slavery to describe her treatment as a white servant. Peter Williamson's published narrative used the term slave trade to describe the Aberdeen kidnapping operation. The statutes themselves reveal the reality. Virginia's 1670 statute reads, "Whereas it hath been questioned whether Indians or Negroes manumitted or otherwise free could be capable of purchasing Christian servants." Think about that sentence. It had been questioned, meaning the practice existed. Indians and blacks were buying white Christians. The statute banned the practice. But the fact that the ban was necessary means it was happening. The 1670 statute was reinforced in 1705. which stated that no Negro, mulatto, or Indian shall at any time purchase any Christian servant. Why pass the same law twice unless people were violating it? The documentary evidence is clear. Indians owned white servants, free blacks owned white servants. Cherokee plantations in the 18th century worked white and black slaves side by side. The racial categories we think are ancient and fixed were actually created during the colonial period to replace the class solidarity that had threatened the elite during Bacon's rebellion. What they teach you, history is complicated, and we should not judge the past by modern standards. What the sources show, people at the time knew exactly what they were doing, and many of them said it was wrong. De Vries said gambling with human beings was not even done by Turks and barbarians. Franklin called convict transportation the cruelest insult one people ever offered another. Cobbett documented teenage boys hanged for stealing sheep and called it a moral abomination. Hanway fought the workhouse system and proved the 90% death rate was preventable by reducing it to below 25%. The Privy Council had to specifically authorize forcing children onto ships because the children resisted. Massachusetts witnesses testified under oath about children stolen from their beds in Ireland. The plea to not judge the past is a plea to ignore what people at the time said in their own words. They knew, they documented it, and we ignore the documentation. The silence is the point. You can walk through the National Museum of American History in Washington and see extensive exhibits on African slavery. You will see shackles, bills of sale, wanted posters for runaways. You will see the names of slave traders and plantation owners. You will learn about resistance and rebellion. It is powerful, necessary, and absolutely appropriate that this history is preserved and taught. You will not see a single exhibit about the 300,000 white people shipped in bondage. You will not see Peter Williamson's account book from Aberdeen showing 600 children kidnapped. You will not see the shipping manifest classifying children as half-freight. You will not see Pope Alvy's pardon after beating Alice Sanford to a jelly. You will not see the Maryland Gazette advertisements for white servant women sold as breeding stock. You will not see the court records of Isaac Friend and William Clutton planning rebellion in 1661. You will not see Jonas Hanway's statistics showing 90% child mortality in London workhouses. You will not see the Privy Council authorization to force children onto ships. You will not see any of it. The sources exist. Abbott Emerson Smith, Edmund Morgan, Don Jordan, Michael Walsh, Peter Wilson Coldham, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Sharon Salinger, Richard Morris, Warren B. Smith, all published by major university presses, all won awards. All cited thousands of primary documents. The evidence is there. The documentation is overwhelming. The archives are open, and yet the story remains untold. The textbooks dedicate one paragraph to indentured servitude, describing it as voluntary contracts for free passage. The museums are silent. The curriculum is sanitized. The national memory has been scrubbed. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is why we refuse to look at it. Michael Hoffman published a short polemical book using fragments from these scholars' work. Even he barely scratched the surface. The full record is vastly more detailed, more documented, more damning than anything in his book. The scholars did the work. They compiled the names. They extracted the court records. They calculated the mortality rates. They found the bills of sale, the ship manifests, the pardon records, the testimony of witnesses who saw children stolen from their beds. It is all there, in footnotes and appendices and archival citations, waiting for anyone willing to read it. The establishment published the sources that prove the establishment is lying. That is the final irony. The very universities that now teach sanitized history publish the books that document the unsanitized truth. Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, the University of North Carolina Press, all published meticulous documentation of a system that worked hundreds of thousands of white people to death. Then the same universities ignore those books when teaching undergraduates. The sources sit on the shelves gathering dust, while professors assign textbooks that describe indentured servitude as a benign labor contract. This is not conspiracy. This is not suppression. This is worse. This is selective blindness. The truth is published, available, cited, and simply not taught. The archives are open. The books are in print, and nobody reads them. The memorial is silent. The curriculum is incomplete. And the students never learn what their ancestors endured. The evidence is there. It always was.